The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the Cedar Valley Animal Shelter like fingers tapping an anxious rhythm. I was 12 years old, standing in that sterile hallway that smelled of disinfectant and hope, watching my mom fill out paperwork at the front desk. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, clinical glow that made the colorful "Find Your Forever Friend" posters on the walls look almost desperate. I didn't want to be there. Not really. It had been 6 months since we'd lost Copper, our golden retriever who'd been with us since I was 5. 6 months of walking past his empty food bowl that Mom kept forgetting to put away. Of catching myself saving the last bite of my sandwich for a dog who would never come running again. Mom thought getting a new dog would help us heal, but I wasn't ready to love something else that could just disappear. "Lily, honey, why don't you walk around and see if anyone catches your eye?" Mom's voice carried that forced cheerfulness she'd been using a lot lately, the same tone she used when she talked about Dad's business trips that kept getting longer and longer. The volunteer, a kind-faced woman named Sarah with gray streaks in her auburn hair, gestured toward the kennel area. "Take your time, sweetheart. Sometimes the right match just knows when to show itself." I nodded politely and wandered into the main kennel area, where the symphony of barking, whining, and scratching filled the air. Dogs of every size and color pressed against chain-link gates, their tails wagging with desperate hope. A young pit bull mix jumped repeatedly at his kennel door, his whole body wiggling with enthusiasm. An elderly beagle lay curled in the corner, barely lifting her head to acknowledge my presence. 3 puppies tumbled over each other in a playful pile, their yips echoing off the concrete walls. But it was the dog in kennel number 17 that stopped me in my tracks. He was medium-sized, with a coat that might have once been golden but had faded to the color of autumn wheat. His ears hung low, and his brown eyes held a depth of sadness that seemed to mirror something I recognized in my own reflection lately. Unlike the other dogs, he didn't bark or jump when I approached. He simply sat in the back corner of his kennel, watching me with those intelligent, weary eyes. "That's Bruno," Sarah said softly, appearing beside me. "He's been with us for about 8 months now. Came in as a stray, no identification except—" She paused, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Well, he had this collar. Expensive-looking thing. We kept it in case someone came looking, but—" She shrugged sadly. I knelt down in front of the kennel, and for the first time since arriving, Bruno stood up. He approached slowly, cautiously, as if he'd learned that human attention could disappear as quickly as it arrived. When he reached the gate, he sat again and tilted his head slightly, studying my face with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "Can I meet him?" I whispered. Sarah glanced back toward the front desk, where Mom was still buried in paperwork, then looked down at me with understanding in her eyes. "Of course. Let me get him into one of the meeting rooms." The small meeting room was painted a cheerful yellow that was supposed to feel welcoming, but somehow just made the whole situation feel more serious. Sarah brought Bruno in on a simple rope leash, and he immediately settled in the corner, watching me with those same thoughtful eyes. "Take your time," Sarah said, closing the door behind her. "I'll be right outside if you need anything." For several minutes, Bruno and I just looked at each other. I'd expected him to come over, to try to win me over like the other dogs had done. Instead, he seemed to be waiting for something, as if he understood that trust had to be earned, not demanded. Slowly, I scooted across the linoleum floor until I was sitting about 3 feet away from him. "Hey, Bruno," I said softly. His ears perked up slightly at the sound of his name. I lost my dog, too. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically but enough that I noticed. He took a tentative step forward, then another, until he was close enough that I could reach out and touch him if I wanted to. I extended my hand, palm up, and waited. After what felt like forever, Bruno stretched his neck forward and gently sniffed my fingers. His nose was warm and slightly wet, and when he looked up at me again, I could have sworn I saw recognition there. Not of me specifically, but of the feeling I was carrying. The hollow ache of missing someone who wasn't coming back. That's when I noticed the collar. It wasn't the simple nylon collar the shelter typically used. This was leather, rich brown and worn smooth with age, with intricate stitching along the edges. As Bruno moved closer and finally laid his head on my lap, I could see something engraved on a small silver tag. The letters were partially worn, but I could make out what looked like BRUNO, and below it, in smaller script, something else. My heart started beating faster as I gently turned the tag to catch the light from the overhead fixture. The second line of engraving was harder to read, weathered by time and wear, but as I squinted at it, the letters began to form words that made my breath catch in my throat. Property of Luna, and then a phone number. Luna. The name hit me like a physical blow, because I knew that name. Everyone in America knew that name, even kids like me, who usually listened to whatever was popular on TikTok. Luna Hartwell, the singer who had vanished without a trace 3 years ago, right at the height of her career. The beautiful woman with the haunting voice who had dominated the country music charts for 5 straight years before disappearing from her Nashville home one October evening, leaving behind only her car in the driveway and her purse on the kitchen counter. I stared down at Bruno, who was now resting peacefully with his head on my lap, completely unaware that he might be the key to one of the most famous missing person cases in recent history. His breathing was slow and steady, and for the first time since entering the shelter, he looked almost content. "Luna," I whispered, and Bruno's ears twitched. Not quite recognition, but something close to it. My hands were shaking as I gently stroked his head, my mind racing. How had Bruno ended up here, in a small-town shelter in Ohio, hundreds of miles from Nashville? Where had he been for the past 3 years? And most importantly, what did he know about what happened to Luna Hartwell? Through the window of the meeting room, I could see Mom finishing up her paperwork, and Sarah was walking back toward us with a hopeful smile on her face. I had maybe 2 minutes to decide what to do with this information before they expected me to make a choice about Bruno. But looking down at him, at the trust he'd finally placed in me by resting his head on my lap, at the way his breathing had evened out for the first time, probably since he'd arrived here 8 months ago, I realized the choice had already been made. I wasn't just adopting a dog, I was taking home a mystery, a living connection to a story that had captivated the entire country. But more than that, I was taking home a creature who understood loss the way I did, who carried secrets and sadness in his eyes, but was still willing to trust again. "We're going to figure this out together," I whispered to Bruno, as Sarah's hand appeared on the door handle. "I promise." And as Bruno lifted his head to look at me one more time before Sarah entered the room, I could have sworn I saw something like hope flicker in those deep brown eyes, the same hope that was beginning to bloom in my chest for the first time in 6 months. The rain had stopped while we were in the meeting room, and thin streams of afternoon sunlight were beginning to break through the gray Ohio sky, painting everything in shades of gold that reminded me of Bruno's coat. As Sarah opened the door with that expectant smile, I knew that whatever came next, everything was about to change. But I had no idea just how much one dog's secret would transform not just my understanding of love and loss, but my entire family's future. The drive home from Cedar Valley Animal Shelter felt different with Bruno in the back seat. Mom had been surprised by my choice. I could see it in her eyes when I told her I wanted the quiet dog in Kennel 17 instead of one of the playful puppies or friendly mixed breeds that had vied for attention. But she'd learned not to question my decisions too much since Copper died. Grief, I'd discovered, bought you a certain amount of space from well-meaning adults who were afraid of saying the wrong thing. Bruno sat perfectly still during the 20-minute drive to our house on Maple Street, his nose pressed against the window, but his body rigid with the kind of tension that spoke of experience with car rides that didn't end well. I kept one hand extended toward him, not quite touching, but close enough that he could feel my presence if he needed reassurance. Our house was a modest 2-story colonial with white siding and blue shutters, surrounded by the kind of mature oak trees that made autumn in Ohio look like something from a postcard. Mom had planted mums in the flower boxes just last week, bursts of orange and yellow that should have felt cheerful, but somehow just reminded me of how hard she was trying to keep things normal. Dad's car wasn't in the driveway, which wasn't surprising. He'd been traveling more for work lately, something about expanding his consulting business to new markets. At least, that's what he told us. I was starting to suspect it had more to do with the way conversations in our house had become carefully orchestrated around the things we didn't want to talk about. "Let's get Bruno settled," Mom said, with that same bright voice she'd been using for months. I stopped by the pet store yesterday and picked up some supplies just in case. The just in case part stung a little, like she hadn't been sure I'd be able to go through with getting another dog. But as I watched Bruno carefully step out of the car and stand in our driveway, taking in the scents and sounds of what would hopefully become his new home, I pushed down my annoyance. Mom was trying. We were all trying. Inside, she'd set up a dog bed in the corner of the living room, along with food and water bowls and a few toys that looked painfully new and untested. Bruno approached each item cautiously, sniffing but not touching, like he was afraid to assume anything belonged to him. "I'll let you two get acquainted," Mom said, hovering in the doorway between the living room and kitchen. "I should start dinner. Your father's flight gets in around 8, and I thought we could have a family meal to welcome Bruno home properly." After she disappeared into the kitchen, I sat cross-legged on the living room floor and watched Bruno explore. He moved methodically, checking each corner and doorway before settling on a spot near the window where he could see both the front yard and keep an eye on me. Smart. A dog who'd learned to be strategic about positioning. That's when I got my first real chance to examine his collar up close. I'd been thinking about it during the entire drive home, turning over possibilities in my mind. Maybe Luna was a common name, and the phone number was just a coincidence. Maybe the collar had been a hand-me-down from a previous owner. Maybe I was letting my imagination run wild because I wanted to believe I'd stumbled into something bigger than just adoption day at a local animal shelter. But when Bruno finally relaxed enough to lie down and I could see the collar clearly in the afternoon light streaming through our front windows, all my rational explanations crumbled. The leather was high quality, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of expensive custom work. The stitching was done in gold thread, and there were tiny musical notes embossed along the band, details that would have been meaningful to a country music star, but random for anyone else. The silver tag was substantial, heavier than the aluminum tags most pet stores sold, and engraved with professional precision. When I gently turned it to read the phone number, my heart started racing again. I'd memorized Luna Hartwell's story over the years, the way kids my age memorized the lyrics to their favorite songs. The phone number on Bruno's tag started with 615, Nashville's area code. I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen for a long moment. What exactly was I planning to do? Call a 3-year-old phone number that probably didn't work anymore? And if someone answered, what would I say? "Hi, I think I have your missing dog, and also, do you know what happened to Luna Hartwell?" Instead, I opened Google and typed "Luna Hartwell Missing 2021" into the search bar. The results filled my screen immediately, articles from CNN, Entertainment Tonight, Rolling Stone, People magazine. Photos of a woman with long, honey-blonde hair and striking green eyes, wearing everything from glamorous red carpet gowns to simple jeans and boots on stage. Headlines that had dominated the news cycle for months. Country star vanishes without trace. Luna Hartwell investigation continues. Family desperate for answers in singer's disappearance. I clicked on a People magazine article from 6 months after she'd disappeared, and Bruno lifted his head when I gasped out loud. There, in a sidebar showing items missing from Luna's home, was a photograph of a dog collar. The caption read, "Luna's beloved golden retriever mix, Bruno, also disappeared the night she vanished." The custom leather collar, shown above, was made by Nashville artisan James Wheeler and features Luna's personal phone number and gold musical note details. The collar in the photograph was identical to the one around Bruno's neck. My hands were shaking as I took a screenshot, then another of the main article, then another of a timeline showing Luna's last known activities. According to the reports, she'd been seen leaving a recording studio at 6 p.m. on October 15, 2021. Her car was found in her driveway the next morning, keys still in the ignition. Her manager had gone to check on her when she missed a scheduled phone interview and found the front door unlocked, Luna's purse on the kitchen counter, and no sign of her or Bruno. "Where have you been for 3 years?" I whispered to Bruno, who was watching me with those knowing eyes. "What happened to her?" As if in response to my questions, Bruno stood up and walked over to where I was sitting. For the first time since we'd met, he initiated contact, gently placing his paw on my leg and looking directly into my eyes. There was something urgent in his expression, something that made my chest tighten with emotion I couldn't quite name. "I know you can't tell me," I said softly, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. "But I'm going to help you. I'm going to figure out how to get you home." Even as I said the words, I realized how complicated they were. Home to where? To whom? Luna had been missing for 3 years. For all I knew, she was... I couldn't finish that thought. But if she was gone, then Bruno was truly an orphan, just like I'd felt since losing Copper. From the kitchen came the sounds of Mom preparing dinner, the chop of vegetables, the sizzle of something in a pan, the familiar rhythm of her cooking routine that usually made the house feel like home. But tonight, with Bruno's secret weighing on my chest and all those unanswered questions spinning through my mind, even our kitchen sounds felt different. Temporary, like we were all just going through motions while waiting for something to change. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Chloe. "How did adoption day go? Send pics." I looked down at Bruno, who had settled beside me with his head resting against my leg. How could I explain any of this? That I'd adopted not just a dog, but a mystery that connected to one of the most famous disappearances in recent history. That I was sitting in my living room with what might be the only living witness to whatever had happened to Luna Hartwell. Instead, I took a simple photo of Bruno lying peacefully beside me and typed back, "Meet Bruno. I think he's got some stories to tell." If only I knew how true those words would prove to be, or how those stories would end up changing everything I thought I knew about love, loss, and the families we choose when the ones we're born into start falling apart. As the sun set behind our oak trees and the smell of Mom's pot roast began filling the house, I made a silent promise to Bruno and to Luna, wherever she was. I was going to find out the truth. I was going to solve this mystery. And maybe, just maybe, I was going to help bring them both home. But first, I had to figure out how to tell my parents that our new family member might be the key to the biggest missing person case in country music history. Dad came home at 8:47 p.m., 13 minutes after Mom's perfect timing pot roast had finished resting, and 47 minutes after I'd decided I couldn't tell my parents about Bruno's collar. Not yet. The decision had crystallized when I'd overheard Mom on the phone with her sister, Aunt Patricia, explaining in careful, measured tones that the new dog was good for Lily and might help our family feel more complete again. The thing about adults, I'd learned, is that they have a tendency to take over situations they think are too big for kids to handle. And while finding Bruno felt like the most important thing that had ever happened to me, I knew that if I told Mom and Dad about the collar, about Luna Hartwell, about the mystery that had been dropped into my lap, they'd want to call the police immediately. Bruno would become evidence instead of family. He'd be taken away before I even had a chance to help him feel safe again. So when Dad walked through the front door, loosening his tie and carrying the slightly defeated posture that seemed to follow him home from business trips lately, I simply introduced him to Bruno, our new dog, and watched as my father knelt down and let Bruno sniff his hand with the kind of patience that reminded me why I'd always felt safe with him. "He's a good-looking boy," Dad said, gently scratching behind Bruno's ears. "Seems calm. That's nice after..." He paused, glancing at Mom, and I knew he'd been about to mention Copper. That's nice for a house like ours. Dinner was a careful orchestration of normalcy. Mom had made all of Dad's favorites: pot roast with carrots and potatoes, homemade rolls, green bean casserole from the recipe she'd inherited from Grandma Rose. Dad told us about his client meetings in Chicago, sanitized stories about market research and corporate strategy that felt designed to reassure rather than inform. I talked about school, about my English teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, who was making us read Where the Red Fern Grows, and how it was making me cry every night. And Bruno lay quietly beside my chair, occasionally accepting small pieces of pot roast that I slipped him when my parents weren't looking, his presence somehow making everything feel both more complete and more fragile at the same time. It wasn't until after Dad went upstairs to unpack and Mom started loading the dishwasher that I got my chance to do what I'd been planning all evening. While Mom hummed softly to herself in the kitchen, she always hummed when she was trying to convince herself everything was fine, I slipped upstairs to my bedroom with Bruno following silently behind me. My room was my sanctuary, decorated with photos of friends, movie posters, and a bulletin board covered with ticket stubs from concerts and school events. My laptop sat on my desk next to a stack of homework I'd been ignoring, and as I opened it up and logged into my social media accounts, Bruno settled on the rug beside my chair like he'd been sleeping there for years. I started with Instagram, searching for Luna Hartwell's official account. It was still active, maintained by her management team according to the bio, with posts asking people to share any information about her disappearance and thanking fans for their continued support. The most recent post from just 2 weeks ago showed a sunset over Nashville with the caption, 3 years. We still believe. We still hope. Bring Luna home. The comments section broke my heart. Thousands of people sharing memories, theories, prayers. Fans who'd never met Luna but whose lives had been touched by her music, who refused to give up hope that she might still be out there somewhere. I scrolled through them for over an hour, looking for anything that might help me understand what had happened or where Bruno had been all this time. Then I found something that made me sit up straight in my desk chair. It was a comment from 6 months ago on a post about Luna's missing dog. A user named A Country Music Detective had written, "Check shelters in Ohio and Indiana." Someone reported seeing a dog matching Bruno's description at a truck stop near Dayton back in 2022. Collar was dirty but looked expensive. Just a tip for anyone still searching. Ohio. Dayton was only 2 hours from where we lived, and Bruno had been at Cedar Valley Animal Shelter for 8 months, which would put his arrival there around January 2024. The timeline was starting to make sense, but it raised even more questions. Had Bruno been living as a stray for over 2 years? How had he survived? And why had no one connected him to Luna until now? I clicked on our Country Music Detective's profile and found a treasure trove of information about Luna's case. This person, their real name wasn't listed, had been meticulously documenting every lead, every theory, every sighting reported by fans and amateur investigators across the country. They'd created detailed maps showing possible routes Luna might have taken, analyzed her phone records and social media posts from the weeks before she disappeared, and compiled witness statements from people who claimed to have seen her after October 15, 2021. Most of it felt like conspiracy theory territory. Claims that Luna had been spotted in gas stations in Kentucky, diners in Tennessee, airport security footage from places as far away as Montana and Texas. But buried in all the speculation were nuggets of genuine investigation. Timeline analyses that showed inconsistencies in the official police reports. Questions about why certain pieces of evidence hadn't been released to the public, and a recurring theory that Luna might have been running from something or someone. I was deep into reading a post about Luna's financial records when Bruno suddenly stood up and walked to my bedroom window. His body language changed completely, ears alert, muscles tense, a low whine building in his throat. I followed his gaze and saw a car I didn't recognize parked across the street, its headlights off, but the engine running. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, joining him at the window. The car was a dark sedan, too expensive looking for our neighborhood, with tinted windows that made it impossible to see inside. As we watched, it sat there for several more minutes before finally pulling away slowly. No rush, like whoever was inside had gotten whatever information they'd come for. Bruno remained tense, even after the car disappeared, pacing my small bedroom with the kind of restless energy that spoke of deeply ingrained hypervigilance. This wasn't normal dog behavior. This was the behavior of an animal who'd learned that safety was temporary and danger could appear without warning. "You're scared," I said softly, settling on my bedroom floor and patting my lap. "It's okay. You're safe now." But even as I said the words, I felt a chill run down my spine. Because if Bruno really was Luna Hartwell's dog, if he really was connected to her disappearance, then his presence in our home might not be as safe and simple as I'd thought. There might be people looking for him, people who didn't want the mystery of Luna's disappearance to be solved. Bruno eventually came to me, pressing his warm body against mine and letting me hold him while his breathing slowly returned to normal. In the soft glow of my desk lamp, I could see every detail of his weathered collar, every carefully crafted musical note etched into the leather, every letter of Luna's name. I thought about the car outside, about the timing of its appearance, just as I'd been digging deeper into Luna's case. I thought about the Country Music Detective's post about Ohio sightings, about how Bruno had survived for years before ending up in our local shelter, about all the questions that seemed to lead only to more questions. And I realized that adopting Bruno hadn't just given me a new dog to love. It had put all of us, at the center of a mystery that someone, somewhere, might be willing to kill to keep buried. As I turned off my laptop and got ready for bed, with Bruno curled up on the rug beside me like he belonged there, I made another silent promise. I was going to protect him the way he'd never been protected before. I was going to find out what had happened to Luna, and I was going to make sure that whatever forces had separated them would never hurt anyone in my family. But first, I needed help. Real help. From someone who understood what we were dealing with. Tomorrow, I decided, I was going to reach out to Watch Country Music Detective and find out exactly how deep this mystery really went. I waited until lunch period the next day to send the message. Sitting in the corner of our school's library, surrounded by the familiar smell of old books and that industrial carpet they'd installed sometime in the 1990s, I typed and retyped my direct message to Country Music Detective at least 6 times before finally hitting send. Hi, I saw your posts about Luna Hartwell and her missing dog Bruno. I think I might have found him. Can we talk? I attached one of the photos I'd taken of Bruno the night before, making sure his collar was visible, and included a close-up shot of the engraved tag. Then I closed my laptop and tried to focus on my afternoon classes, though my mind kept wandering back to that mysterious car outside our house and the way Bruno had reacted to it. The response came faster than I'd expected. By the time I got home from school, there were 3 new messages waiting in my Instagram DMs. Holy shit, sorry for the language, but holy shit, that's definitely Bruno. Where did you find him? Are you safe? Don't post anything else about this online until we talk. Call me tonight. Here's my number. The number had a 615 area code, Nashville. I stared at the messages for a long moment, my heart pounding. This was it. The moment when I'd either take the next step into whatever this mystery really was, or decide it was too big and scary for a 12-year-old girl from Ohio to handle. I looked down at Bruno, who was lying on my bedroom floor in the same spot he'd claimed the night before, and made my choice. At 7 o'clock, while Mom was downstairs watching her Wednesday night cooking shows, and Dad was locked in his home office taking what he claimed was an important conference call, I dialed the number. A woman answered on the second ring. Lily? I'd given her my first name in one of the Instagram messages, but hearing it spoken by a stranger still made me jump. Yes, this is me. Thank God. The voice was older than I'd expected, maybe somewhere in her 40s, with a slight southern accent that spoke of years in Nashville. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm a private investigator, and I've been working Luna's case since 6 months after she disappeared. You're not just a fan? A soft laugh. Oh, honey, I'm definitely a fan. Luna's music got me through my divorce back in 2019. But I'm also a professional. And this case has consumed 3 years of my life. I could hear the exhaustion in her voice and something else that sounded like hope mixed with desperation. Tell me everything, she said. How you found Bruno, where he's been, what condition he's in. Don't leave out any details, no matter how small they seem. So I did. I told her about the Cedar Valley Animal Shelter, about Bruno's kennel in the back corner, about the way he'd seemed to be waiting for something. I described his behavior, his wariness, the way he'd reacted to the strange car outside our house. I told her about the timeline, 8 months at the shelter, which meant he'd arrived sometime in early 2024. But where he'd been for the 2.5 years before, that was still a mystery. Sarah listened without interrupting, occasionally making soft sounds of acknowledgement. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Lily, she finally said, you have no idea how important this is. Bruno isn't just Luna's dog. He's the only witness to whatever happened that night. But he can't talk. No, but dogs remember everything. The places they've been, the people they've encountered, the routines they've learned. If I could spend some time with him, observe his reactions to different stimuli, I might be able to piece together where he's been and what he's experienced. I felt a flutter of panic in my chest. You want to take him away? No, sweetheart. I want to help you protect him. Because if I'm right about what happened to Luna, there are people who would do anything to make sure Bruno never leads us to the truth. She went on to explain what she'd discovered in 3 years of investigation. Luna hadn't just disappeared. She'd been receiving threatening messages for months before she vanished. Someone had been stalking her, showing up at recording sessions, sending flowers to her home address, leaving voicemails that grew increasingly obsessive and frightening. The police treated it as a standard missing person case, Sarah said, her voice growing angry. Rich celebrity probably ran off with a secret boyfriend, that kind of thinking. They didn't take the stalking seriously until it was too late. Do you think he did something to her? Another long pause. I think Luna figured out who was stalking her, and it was someone with enough power to make her disappear. Someone who couldn't afford to be exposed. She told me about the inconsistencies in the official investigation. Security footage that had been mysteriously corrupted. Witnesses who'd changed their stories after talking to police. A crime scene that had been contaminated before proper evidence collection could take place. Luna's management company is connected to some very powerful people in Nashville, Sarah continued. Music industry executives, politicians, wealthy investors. If one of them was stalking her, they'd have the resources to cover it up. And Bruno saw what happened. Which is why he's been in hiding for 3 years and why someone might still be looking for him. The car outside our house suddenly made more sense, and I felt a chill run down my spine. What should I do? First, don't tell anyone else about this yet. Not your parents, not your friends, not anyone at school. The fewer people who know, the safer Bruno will be. I don't like keeping secrets from my mom and dad. Sarah's voice softened. I understand, honey. But right now, the best way to protect your family is to keep them out of this until I can figure out how to proceed safely. Can you do that for me? Just for a few more days? I looked down at Bruno, who had moved closer to my chair while I'd been talking, as if he could sense the importance of the conversation. His eyes met mine, and I saw that same urgent expression he'd had the day before, like he was trying to tell me something vital. Yes, I said. I can do that. Good girl. Now I'm going to drive up to Ohio tomorrow. I'll rent a car and stay in a hotel. Nothing that can be traced back to you or your family. Can you meet me somewhere public? Somewhere we can talk and I can observe Bruno without drawing attention? We settled on Riverside Park, the large public park about 10 minutes from my house, that was always busy with joggers, dog walkers, and families. I could tell my parents I was taking Bruno for a long walk to help him get used to the neighborhood. Lily, Sarah said before hanging up, I want you to know how brave you're being. Most adults would have turned Bruno over to the authorities immediately and washed their hands of the whole situation. The fact that you're willing to help him, to protect him, Luna would be proud. After I hung up, I sat in my bedroom for a long time, staring at Bruno and trying to process everything Sarah had told me. My new dog wasn't just a rescue from the local animal shelter. He was a survivor of something terrible, a living witness to a crime that might have involved some of the most powerful people in the music industry. And somehow, he'd found his way to me. I thought about Copper, about how he'd always seemed to know when I was sad or scared, how he'd had an uncanny ability to show up exactly when I needed him most. Maybe that's what good dogs do. They find the people who need them and create the families they never had. Tomorrow we're going to start getting some answers, I whispered to Bruno, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. Tomorrow we're going to figure out how to bring you home. But as I said the words, I realized I wasn't sure anymore what home meant for Bruno. Was it back to whatever remained of Luna's life in Nashville? Or was it here, in this small house in Ohio, with a family who was learning how to love again after loss? One way or another, I was determined to find out, even if it meant uncovering truths that some very dangerous people wanted to keep buried forever. Chapter 5. The Meeting in the Park. The next afternoon, Riverside Park buzzed with the kind of autumn activity that made small-town Ohio feel like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Joggers traced the winding paths that bordered the Scioto River, their breath visible in small puffs in the crisp October air. A group of teenagers played frisbee on the main lawn, their laughter carrying across the open space. Elderly couples sat on benches feeding ducks, and young mothers pushed strollers while talking on their phones. I'd chosen a picnic table near the playground, far enough from the main walking paths to have privacy, but close enough to other families that we wouldn't look suspicious. Bruno walked beside me calmly, taking in all the new scents and sounds with what I was beginning to recognize as his characteristic wariness. Alert, but not anxious. Ready, but not aggressive. Sarah Chen was nothing like I'd expected. When she approached our table carrying 2 coffee cups from the Starbucks near the park entrance, I'd been looking for someone more dramatic, more mysterious. Instead, she looked like any of the professional women who worked in Columbus and lived in our suburb. Mid-40s, Asian American, wearing jeans and a quilted jacket, with shoulder-length black hair streaked with gray and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You must be Lily," she said, setting one of the cups in front of me. "Hot chocolate. I figured coffee might not be your thing." "Thank you," I said, suddenly feeling shy. Meeting a stranger from the internet was exactly the kind of thing my parents had warned me never to do. But here I was, potentially putting my family in danger because I'd fallen in love with a dog who might be the key to solving a famous disappearance. Sarah's attention immediately focused on Bruno, and I watched her professional demeanor shift into something more intense and focused. She didn't try to pet him or call his name. Instead, she simply sat across from me and observed, taking in every detail of his appearance and behavior. "How has he been sleeping?" she asked. "Really well, actually. He stays in my room, usually on the floor next to my bed. He doesn't seem to have nightmares or anything. And eating? Normal appetite. He's not picky, but he's careful, like he waits to make sure the food is really for him before he starts eating." Sarah nodded, making notes on her phone. "That's consistent with a dog who's experienced food insecurity. What about stranger interactions? How does he react to new people?" I thought about our walks around the neighborhood, about the way Bruno had responded to our mail carrier and the neighbor kids who'd wanted to pet him. He's polite but distant, like he's learned good manners but doesn't really trust anyone. And cars? Traffic? A chill ran down my spine as I remembered his reaction to the mysterious sedan outside our house. He's very alert to cars that don't belong. Yesterday there was a strange car on our street, and he got really tense. Not scared exactly, but watchful. Sarah's expression grew serious. "What kind of car?" "Dark sedan. Expensive looking. Tinted windows. It just sat there for a few minutes with the engine running, then drove away slowly." "Has it been back?" "Not that I've seen, but—" I hesitated, not sure how to voice the feeling that had been growing in my chest since yesterday. "I feel like someone's been watching us. Nothing specific, just a feeling." Sarah reached into her jacket and pulled out her phone, showing me a photograph of a man in his 50s with silver hair and cold blue eyes. "Have you seen this person anywhere? Near your house, around town, here in the park?" I studied the photo carefully, but shook my head. "Who is he?" "Marcus Holloway. He was Luna's manager, and I believe he was also her stalker." The hot chocolate suddenly tasted bitter in my mouth. Her own manager? It's more common than you'd think. Someone in a position of trust who becomes obsessed, who has access to personal information and private moments. Marcus had keys to Luna's house, knew her schedule, controlled much of her public image, and he had the power to make problems disappear. Sarah showed me more photos, screenshots of social media posts, security camera footage, articles from Nashville entertainment magazines. Marcus Holloway appeared in many of them, always in the background, always watching Luna with an intensity that seemed inappropriate for a professional relationship. 3 weeks before she disappeared, Luna fired him, Sarah continued. She'd finally figured out he was behind the stalking. She was planning to go public to press charges. And then she vanished, along with Bruno, who would have barked if a stranger had broken into the house. But Marcus wasn't a stranger. Bruno would have known him, trusted him, at least initially. I looked down at Bruno, who was lying peacefully beside our picnic table, and tried to imagine what he might have witnessed that October night 3 years ago. Had he seen Marcus take Luna? Had he tried to protect her? How had he ended up separated from her, alone and on the run for years? "I think Marcus took them both," Sarah said quietly. "Luna and Bruno. And I think something went wrong. Maybe Luna fought back, maybe she tried to escape, but somehow Bruno got away, and he's been surviving on his own ever since. But where is Luna?" Sarah's eyes filled with a sadness that spoke of years of searching, years of hoping for answers that might never come. "I don't know, sweetheart, but Bruno might be our only chance of finding out." She explained her plan. She wanted to bring Bruno back to Nashville, to take him to places he would have been with Luna. Her house, the recording studio, places around the city where they'd spent time together. If her theory was right, Bruno's reactions to these locations might help them reconstruct what had happened that night. It's called scent memory and location recognition, she explained. Dogs remember places and associate them with emotional experiences. If Bruno showed stress or excitement at certain locations, it could help us narrow down where Marcus might have taken Luna. You want me to come with you? It wasn't a question. I could see it in her eyes, the understanding that Bruno trusted me in a way he might not trust anyone else. I know it's asking a lot. You'd have to lie to your parents, Miss School, potentially put yourself in danger if Marcus realizes what we're doing. I thought about my conversation with Bruno 2 nights ago, about the promise I'd made to help him find his way home. I thought about Luna Hartwell, who might still be alive somewhere, waiting for someone to care enough to keep searching. I thought about my own family, about how we'd all been drifting apart since Copper died, how we'd stopped believing in the possibility of finding what we'd lost. When would we go? This weekend. I can pick you up Friday evening, we'll drive through the night to Nashville, spend Saturday following Bruno's reactions around the city, and have you back by Sunday evening. Your parents would never have to know. It was crazy. It was dangerous. It was exactly the kind of impulsive decision that could get me into more trouble than I'd ever imagined. But looking down at Bruno, seeing the trust in his eyes and the weight of secrets he'd been carrying alone for 3 years, I knew I didn't really have a choice. Okay, I said. Let's go find Luna. Sarah smiled for the first time since I'd met her, and for a moment she looked less like a hardened private investigator and more like someone who'd never stopped believing in happy endings. There's one more thing, she said, as we prepared to leave the park. I think Marcus knows Bruno is alive. I think he's been searching for him all this time, because as long as Bruno exists, there's a chance the truth about what happened to Luna will come out. The car outside my house? Probably one of his people, yes, which means we don't have much time. If he realizes where Bruno is, he'll come for him, and he won't care who gets hurt in the process. As we walked back toward the parking area, Bruno staying close to my side, I felt the weight of the decision I'd just made settling on my shoulders. In 3 days, I'd be lying to my parents for the first time in my life, traveling hundreds of miles with a stranger, and potentially confronting one of the most dangerous men in Nashville. But I'd also be giving Bruno his first real chance to go home, to find peace with whatever had happened to the person he'd loved most in the world. And maybe, just maybe, we'd be giving Luna Hartwell her first real chance to come home too. Friday evening arrived gray and cold, with the kind of steady October drizzle that made everything in Ohio look like it was wrapped in gauze. I'd spent the week perfecting my lie, telling Mom and Dad that I'd been invited to spend the weekend at my friend Chloe's house for her birthday celebration, complete with a sleepover and trip to the Columbus Zoo on Saturday. Chloe, bless her, had agreed to cover for me without asking too many questions, though I could see the curiosity and concern in her eyes when I'd asked for the favor. Just promise me you're not doing anything that will get you killed, she'd said during lunch on Thursday, only half joking. I promise, I'd replied, hoping it was true. The hardest part was watching Mom pack a small overnight bag for me, carefully folding my favorite pajamas and making sure I had my phone charger and enough spending money for zoo snacks. She hummed while she packed, that same nervous humming that meant she was trying to convince herself everything was fine. And I felt the weight of my deception settling in my chest like a stone. You sure you don't want me to drive you over to Chloe's? Dad asked, as I stood in the front hallway with my backpack, waiting for Sarah's text that she was outside. Her mom is picking me up, I said, the lie coming easier than it should have. She wanted to meet Bruno anyway, so I'm bringing him along for the ride. That part, at least, wasn't entirely false. I was bringing Bruno, and Sarah did want to meet him, though not for the innocent reasons I was implying. When my phone buzzed with Sarah's message, blue Honda CR-V parked 2 houses down, I hugged both my parents with an intensity that made Mom pull back and study my face. You okay, sweetheart? You seem different this week. Just excited about the sleepover, I said, forcing a smile. I haven't done anything fun like this since before Copper. I let the sentence trail off, knowing that mentioning our old dog would shift the conversation away from my unusual behavior. It worked. Mom's expression softened into that careful sadness she always wore when Copper came up, and she pulled me into another hug. Have fun, baby. Call me tomorrow night to check in. I will, I promise. Another lie. Tomorrow night I'd be in Nashville, following Bruno through the places he'd once called home, searching for clues to what had happened to Luna Hartwell 3 years ago. Sarah's rental car smelled like new upholstery and the vanilla air freshener hanging from her rearview mirror. She dressed casually for the drive. Jeans, a University of Tennessee sweatshirt, comfortable sneakers, but I could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her eyes constantly checked the mirrors. "Anyone follow you out of the neighborhood?" she asked, as I buckled Bruno into the back seat with a safety harness she'd brought. I twisted around to look through the rear window. Our street looked normal, porch lights glowing in the dusk, neighbors bringing in packages and garden hoses, the familiar rhythm of suburban evening settling in. "I don't think so." "Good. We'll take back roads to Columbus, then hop on I-71 south. Should be in Nashville by 3 a.m. if we don't hit construction." As we pulled away from Maple Street, I felt a flutter of panic in my chest. I was really doing this. I was really lying to my parents, leaving the state with a stranger, potentially putting myself and Bruno in danger because of a mystery I barely understood. But when I looked back at Bruno, who was watching our neighborhood disappear through the window with what looked like eager anticipation, my resolve strengthened. This was his chance. Maybe his only chance. "Tell me about Luna," I said as Sarah navigated the back roads that would take us to the interstate. "What was she like? Before everything happened?" Sarah smiled, and for the first time since I'd met her, the expression looked completely genuine. She was luminous. That's the word that always comes to mind. Not just beautiful, though she was certainly that, but she had this inner light, this authenticity that made everyone around her feel more real somehow. She told me stories as we drove through the darkness, tales that painted a picture of Luna Hartwell that was different from the glamorous country star I'd seen in magazine photos. Luna volunteering at animal shelters between tour dates. Luna writing songs for other artists under assumed names because she didn't want the attention. Luna rescuing Bruno from a kill shelter in Alabama when he was just a puppy, then training him to be her constant companion because she was terrified of being alone. She'd been getting death threats since she was 19. Sarah explained, as we merged onto the interstate and settled in for the long drive south. Not unusual for female performers, unfortunately, but Luna took them seriously. Bruno wasn't just her pet. He was her protection, her early warning system. Her best friend rolled into one. I reached back to scratch Bruno's ears, and he leaned into my touch with a contentment that made my chest ache. How did Marcus become her manager? He was recommended by her record label when she fired her previous management team, came with stellar references, a track record of success with other country artists. Luna thought she was lucky to get someone with his experience. When did things start to change? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter as we passed a semi-truck that seemed to stretch forever into the darkness. "I think it was gradual at first. Marcus becoming more possessive of her time, more controlling about her public appearances, more interested in her personal life than seemed professional." She described a pattern of escalating behavior that had taken place over 2 years. Marcus discouraging Luna from dating, claiming it would hurt her career. Marcus moving his office closer to her home, then showing up at odd hours with urgent business that couldn't wait until morning. Marcus gradually isolating Luna from friends and family members he deemed bad influences on her artistic development. By the time she realized what was happening, Marcus controlled almost every aspect of her professional life, Sarah said. And he'd made himself so essential to her career that she was afraid firing him would ruin everything she'd worked for. But she finally did it anyway. 3 weeks before she disappeared, she'd hired a lawyer, documented the stalking behavior, prepared to go public if necessary. She was scared, but she was also angry. And angry Luna was a force to be reckoned with. We stopped for gas somewhere in Kentucky, at one of those 24-hour truck stops that felt like islands of harsh fluorescent light in an ocean of darkness. While Sarah filled the tank, I walked Bruno around the parking area, letting him stretch his legs and take care of business while I studied the other travelers. Most were long-haul truckers grabbing coffee and snacks for the road ahead. A few were families like mine might have been, parents driving through the night to reach vacation destinations or visit relatives. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that they were sharing a rest stop with a girl and a dog who might be the key to solving one of country music's greatest mysteries. "How much further?" I asked when we got back on the road. "About 4 hours. Try to get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. But sleep felt impossible with my mind racing, and Bruno's occasional soft whines from the back seat. He seemed to sense where we were heading, his restlessness increasing the further south we traveled. Once, when Sarah took an exit that led toward downtown Nashville, Bruno sat up straight and pressed his nose to the window, his whole body tense with recognition. "He knows," Sarah said softly, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "He knows we're bringing him home." As the Nashville skyline came into view around 3:30 a.m., all lit up against the dark Tennessee sky, I felt a mixture of excitement and terror that made my stomach flip. Somewhere in this city was the truth about what had happened to Luna Hartwell. Somewhere in this city were the answers that Bruno had been carrying alone for 3 years. And somewhere in this city, if Sarah was right, was a dangerous man who would do anything to make sure those answers never came to light. "You ready for this?" Sarah asked as we followed the signs toward downtown. I looked back at Bruno, who was now standing in the back seat despite his safety harness, his tail wagging for the first time since I'd known him, his eyes bright with an anticipation that looked almost like hope. "Yeah," I said, though my voice came out smaller and shakier than I'd intended. "I'm ready. But as we drove through the quiet Nashville streets toward the hotel where Sarah had booked us adjoining rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, and that our quest to uncover the truth was about to put all of us in more danger than I'd ever imagined. Saturday morning in Nashville dawned crisp and bright, with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made the city look like something from a travel brochure. Sarah had booked us rooms at a modest hotel near Music Row, and after a few hours of restless sleep, we met for breakfast in the lobby, with Bruno walking calmly between us, drawing admiring glances from other guests who had no idea they were looking at the most famous missing dog in country music. "First stop is Luna's house," Sarah said, as we loaded into her rental car. "It's been sold since she disappeared. The bank took it when she missed mortgage payments. But I want to see how Bruno reacts to the neighborhood." Luna's former home was in Belle Meade, an affluent area of Nashville where old money lived behind perfect landscaping and wrought iron gates. As we drove through streets lined with massive oak trees and elegant mansions, I could see Bruno's behavior changing in the back seat. His breathing quickened, his ears pricked forward, and he began making soft whining sounds that seemed to combine excitement with anxiety. When Sarah turned onto Woodmont Boulevard and slowed the car, Bruno suddenly stood up and pressed his nose against the window, his whole body trembling. We were still 3 blocks from Luna's address, but somehow he knew exactly where we were. "This is it," Sarah said quietly, pulling over to park across the street from a beautiful colonial-style house with white columns and perfectly manicured grounds. "This is where Bruno lived with Luna." The house looked peaceful, normal, like nothing terrible had ever happened there. New owners had painted the front door a cheerful red and planted seasonal flowers along the walkway. A children's bicycle leaned against the front porch, and I could see toys scattered in the side yard, evidence of the happy family that had replaced whatever tragedy had unfolded here 3 years ago. But Bruno's reaction told a different story. The moment Sarah opened the car door, he leaped out and ran straight to the front gate, pressing his body against the iron bars and whimpering with an intensity that made my chest tight. He knew this place. He remembered this place. And he was looking for someone who would never come to the door again. "Luna," I whispered, kneeling beside him and wrapping my arms around his shaking body. I know you miss her." For several minutes we stayed like that. Bruno pressed against the gate of his former home, me holding him while he grieved for a life that had been stolen from both him and Luna. Sarah stood behind us, taking photos and making notes, documenting Bruno's reactions with the thoroughness of someone who understood that every detail might be important. "The police report said there were no signs of struggle inside the house," Sarah said softly. "Luna's purse was on the kitchen counter, her car keys on the front hall table, doors unlocked, like she'd just stepped out for a moment and planned to come right back. But she never did. No, she never did." Our next stop was the recording studio where Luna had been working the day she disappeared. Blackbird Studios was located in an unassuming building near downtown. But as soon as we walked into the lobby with Bruno on his leash, I could feel the history in the air. Photos of famous musicians lined the walls, and gold and platinum records were displayed in cases like trophies of artistic achievement. The receptionist, a young woman with bright purple hair and multiple piercings, looked up when we entered and immediately focused on Bruno. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Is that—" "We're here to see if Bruno remembers the studio," Sarah said carefully. "We're working with private investigators on Luna's case." The receptionist, her name tag said Jenna, came around the desk and knelt in front of Bruno with tears in her eyes. "I was here that day," she said softly. "October 15th. Luna came in around 2 p.m. for a session with her producer. She seemed different, nervous, but also kind of determined, you know? Like she'd made a difficult decision about something." Bruno allowed Jenna to pet him, but his attention was focused on something else, a hallway that led deeper into the building, toward what I assumed were the actual recording rooms. He pulled gently against his leash, wanting to explore, wanting to follow scent memories that were 3 years old, but apparently still vivid to him. "Can we walk him around?" I asked, "just to see how he reacts?" Jenna glanced around the empty lobby, then nodded. "Studio B is where Luna was working that day. I'll show you." As we walked down the hallway, Bruno's excitement increased. He knew exactly where we were going, pulling ahead of us with the confidence of an animal who'd walked this path many times before. When Jenna opened the door to Studio B, Bruno rushed inside and immediately went to a specific corner of the room where a comfortable chair sat next to a small table. "That's where Luna always sat during playback," Jenna said, her voice thick with emotion. She'd bring Bruno to every session, and he'd curl up right there while she listened to takes and made notes. Bruno circled the chair 3 times, then lay down in the exact position Jenna had described, as if Luna might walk through the door at any moment and need her usual spot. The sight broke my heart and filled me with determination at the same time. This dog remembered everything. He'd been waiting 3 years for Luna to come back, and now he was showing us exactly how much he missed the life they'd shared. "Did Luna seem upset when she left that day?" Sarah asked Jenna as we watched Bruno settle into his remembered routine. "Not upset, exactly, but focused, like she had something important to do. She kept checking her phone, and she left about an hour earlier than usual. Said she had to meet someone." "Did she say who?" Jenna shook her head. "No, but I got the impression it was someone she didn't really want to see. You know that feeling when you have to have a difficult conversation with someone? That's what her energy felt like." "Marcus. It had to have been Marcus. Luna had probably arranged to meet him somewhere private, to tell him officially that he was fired and that she intended to go public about his stalking behavior. And somehow, that meeting had ended with both Luna and Bruno disappearing into the night. Our final stop was the most difficult one. Sarah drove us to Centennial Park, a large public space near downtown Nashville, where Luna had often taken Bruno for walks and outdoor photo shoots. According to Sarah's research, this was also where several witnesses claimed to have seen Luna on the evening she disappeared. Conflicting reports that had confused the police investigation, but might make sense if she'd arranged to meet Marcus here. The moment we stepped out of the car, Bruno's demeanor changed completely. The excited recognition he'd shown at the house and studio was replaced by something that looked like fear. He pressed close to my legs, his body tense, his eyes scanning the park as if looking for danger. "He's scared," I said, kneeling beside him. "Something bad happened here." Sarah was taking photos of the park, documenting sightlines and potential escape routes, when Bruno suddenly pulled away from me and ran toward a cluster of large oak trees near the duck pond. I followed, calling his name, but he seemed driven by something beyond my voice. Some memory or instinct that demanded he complete a journey he'd started 3 years ago. He stopped at the base of the largest tree, circling it frantically while whining in a way that made my skin crawl. This wasn't the happy recognition he'd shown at Luna's house, or the comfortable familiarity he'd displayed at the studio. This was trauma. This was the place where something terrible had happened. "Sarah," I called, my voice shaking. "I think we found it. I think this is where Marcus took her." Sarah ran over, immediately pulling out her phone to call someone, probably the Nashville police or maybe FBI agents she'd been working with. But as she started to dial, Bruno's whining turned into something that sounded almost like words, a desperate vocalization that seemed to be trying to tell us something urgent. That's when I saw the car. The same dark sedan that had been outside my house in Ohio was now parked across the street from Centennial Park, its engine running, its occupant hidden behind tinted windows. And as I watched, frozen with fear, the driver's side door opened, and a man in an expensive suit stepped out. Marcus Holloway. It had to be. He was older than in the photos Sarah had shown me, his silver hair thinner, his face harder, but his cold blue eyes were unmistakable, and he was walking directly toward us. "Sarah," I whispered urgently, "he's here. Marcus is here." Sarah looked up from her phone, followed my gaze, and immediately grabbed my arm. "Run," she said. "Take Bruno and run toward the parking area. Get to the car and lock the doors. What about you? I'll be right behind you. Go." But as I turned to run, Bruno pulled in the opposite direction, back toward the tree where he'd been whining. He was trying to tell us something, trying to show us something that might be the key to everything we'd been searching for. "Bruno, come," I pleaded, but he wouldn't move. He kept pawing at the base of the tree, digging frantically in the soft earth as if his life depended on what he might find there. Marcus was getting closer, his pace unhurried but determined, like a man who'd finally cornered prey he'd been hunting for years. Behind him, I could see other figures emerging from cars I hadn't noticed. Men in dark clothing who moved with the professional efficiency of people who made problems disappear. "Lily!" Sarah shouted, but I couldn't leave Bruno. Not when he was this close to showing us what had happened to Luna. Not when we'd come this far together. So I knelt beside him and started digging too, my hands working frantically in the dirt and fallen leaves. And within seconds, my fingers found something that made my heart stop. It was small, metallic, partially buried but unmistakable in the afternoon sunlight. Luna Hartwell's wedding ring, the one she'd been wearing in every photo from the weeks before she disappeared. The one the police had never found, because they'd never thought to look in the place where Bruno had been trying to lead them all along. As Marcus Holloway's footsteps got closer and Sarah screamed at me to run, I held that tiny circle of gold and platinum and realized that Bruno had just solved the mystery of what happened to Luna Hartwell, and that we might not live long enough to tell anyone what we'd discovered. Epilogue. The truth comes home. 6 months later. The courtroom in Nashville was packed with reporters, Luna's family, and fans who had never stopped believing she would come home. I sat in the front row next to my parents, with Bruno lying calmly at my feet, wearing a new collar, simple black leather with just his name and our phone number, because the past was finally where it belonged. Marcus Holloway sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his cold blue eyes avoiding the cameras that had once followed Luna wherever she went. The charges against him were serious: kidnapping, murder in the first degree, obstruction of justice, and a dozen other crimes that would ensure he never saw freedom again. The ring Bruno had led us to, that day in Centennial Park, had been the key to everything. Luna's DNA was on it, along with traces of soil that matched samples from a construction site Marcus had investments in. A site that was supposed to be developed into luxury condos, but had remained empty for 3 years while legal issues were sorted out. When FBI agents excavated the site based on Bruno's discovery, they found Luna's body buried beneath what would have been the foundation of Building 3. She'd been dead since the night she disappeared, which meant Bruno had been grieving and searching for someone who was never coming home. But he'd also been carrying the secret that finally brought her killer to justice. The trial had lasted 4 weeks, and every day Sarah Chen sat behind the prosecutor's table, taking notes and occasionally looking over at me with the kind of pride that made my chest feel tight. She'd become something like a second mom to me over the past 6 months, checking in regularly and helping my family understand what we'd all been through. My parents had been angry at first, terrified about the danger I'd put myself in, hurt that I'd lied to them, overwhelmed by the media attention that had followed Bruno's story. But eventually, they'd come to understand that I'd done what needed to be done to protect a member of our family, even if that member happened to be a dog who'd witnessed a murder. "All rise," the bailiff called, and Judge Patricia Morrison entered the courtroom for the final time. In a few minutes, Marcus Holloway would be sentenced, and the Luna Hartwell case would officially be closed. But for me, the real ending had come 3 weeks ago, when Bruno and I had visited Luna's grave at Woodlawn Memorial Gardens outside Nashville. Sarah had driven us down for the weekend, and we'd spent Saturday morning at the cemetery where Luna was finally at rest beside her grandparents, under a simple headstone that read, Luna Marie Hartwell, daughter, artist, friend. Bruno had approached the grave slowly, cautiously, as if he wasn't sure what he'd find there. But when he reached the headstone, something in his posture had changed. The watchful tension he'd carried for 3 years, the constant alertness that spoke of a dog who'd never felt completely safe, had simply melted away. He'd laid down next to Luna's grave and stayed there for over an hour, not grieving anymore, but peaceful in a way I'd never seen him. Like he'd finally delivered the message he'd been carrying, finally completed the task he'd set for himself on that terrible October night 3 years ago. Now, as Judge Morrison read Marcus Holloway's sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, I reached down to scratch Bruno's ears and thought about how much our lives had changed since that rainy afternoon at Cedar Valley Animal Shelter. My parents were talking again, really talking, about things that mattered instead of pretending everything was fine. Dad had taken a job closer to home, one that didn't require constant travel, because he'd realized that family was more important than advancement. Mom had started volunteering at the same animal shelter where I'd found Bruno, because she said she wanted to help other lost creatures find their way home. And me? I was learning that love wasn't something you lost when someone died or disappeared. Love was something you carried forward, something that connected you to other people and animals who needed what you had to offer. Bruno had taught me that. Luna had taught me that, even though I'd never met her. As we walked out of the courthouse into the bright Tennessee sunshine, reporters called out questions and camera flashes exploded around us. But Bruno walked calmly beside me, no longer the frightened, traumatized dog who'd spent 3 years running from shadows. He was just Bruno now, my dog, my family, my friend who'd trusted me enough to lead me to the truth. How does it feel to know you solved one of the biggest missing person cases in country music history? A reporter asked, shoving a microphone toward my face. I looked down at Bruno, who was sitting patiently beside me while chaos swirled around us, his brown eyes calm and trusting in a way they'd never been when we first met. I didn't solve anything, I said into the microphone. Bruno did. I just listened when he was trying to tell me something important. That evening, we drove back to Ohio with Bruno sleeping peacefully in the back seat, no longer running from anything or searching for someone who couldn't be found. As we crossed the state line and headed toward home, I thought about all the animals waiting in shelters like Cedar Valley, each one carrying their own stories, their own secrets, their own capacity for love that most people never took time to discover. Bruno had been returned to us by love, Luna's love, which had taught him to trust humans even after the worst betrayal imaginable. And that love had created a family he'd never expected to find, in a small town in Ohio, where a girl who'd lost her own dog was ready to open her heart again. Some stories don't have happy endings, but some stories, if you're brave enough to listen and strong enough to follow where they lead, will teach you that love never really disappears. It just finds new ways to come home. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it comes home with 4 paws and a heart big enough to heal an entire family.